In the heat of a late summer afternoon, a young woman of 22 stood barefoot on the packed earth behind a plantation house while a ledger was open on a rough table and a man in a black coat named Master Henry cleared his throat and spoke the words that would strip her of a secret and brand it as crime. Her name was Amina. She had been born on the same soil, and her hands still smelled of coarse cornmeal and ash. The overseer Caleb clicked the pen, and the page recorded not a love story, but a charge. The moment was small and private and utterly decisive. A hand trembling with fear, the rustle of cotton skirts, the metallic taste of a secret about to be named. This scene matters because in institutions that called themselves households and churches, the private became public and the public became property. In parish records and plantation ledgers, the accusation was neat and legal. In the huts and fields, it was a violence that rewired lives. If you think the worst punishment for forbidden affairs was a whipping or a fine, wait until you hear what the masters did. Subscribe if you want the next file opened and the names that the ledgers tried to bleach back into skin. The household that owned Amina combined domestic management with bookkeeping and moral authority. The estate functioned like a small institution, with a steward, overseer, a minister on retainer, and a ledger that regulated human labor the way tax codes regulate coin. In legal papers, the household appeared as charitable in obligations to the parish and obedient to statutes about morality. In practice, it extended credit, enforced debts against bodies, and translated gossip into enforceable rules. There were receipts for grain loans, margin notes in the Minister Jonas file about perceived immorality, archived letters from Mistress Evelyn to a cousin in town instructing transfers of persons between estates. These documents show a pattern. Registers recorded births and punishments side by side. A letter from Scribe Thomas, dated 3 years before Amina was accused, notes that the estate used marriage promises and forced dedications to control labor supply. What was religious language in public notices served an economic purpose behind closed doors. The parish claimed spiritual care, while the ledgers claimed ownership. Researchers at the county archive and at the university's epigraphic unit found line after line where moral transgressions became paperwork. That combination of faith and finance created methods to isolate and punish women whose relationships threatened household order. How did people become part of this system? Some were born to the fields and became the property listed in the opening inventories. Some were sold after debts. Others were transferred after tribunals and church halls that used moral charges as legal cover. Amina had been acquired as an infant when her mother could not pay a mill debt. She remembered the stamp of a mark on a receipt and a brass token that meant ownership. There are entries in the ledger that match her birth month and the notation "bound to service until free," a phrase that sounds benign, but in practice closed off options. 2 scenes of recruitment were typical. In one, the minister Jonas mediated a dedication where a woman was presented as grateful and the congregation applauded, while the ledger noted a new labor allocation. In another, a farmer named Miguel signed a contract transferring 2 women in exchange for 10 bushels of corn and a promise from Master Henry to pay an outstanding loan. Dialogues in these moments crack like glass. In the kitchen, Amina once overheard Rosa the cook and Nurse Maribel whispering. Rosa said, "I heard they will send her to the big house." Maribel answered, "They always call it for the betterments." Rosa said, "Better for whom?" Maribel said, "For the ledgers." Rosa asked, "And the children?" Maribel said, "They are accounted for too." Rosa said, "Who keeps the records?" Maribel said, "Scribe Thomas keeps them." Rosa said, "And the minister?" Maribel said, "Jonas signs when pressed." Rosa asked, "Where is mercy?" Maribel said, "Mercy is written in the margins." Rosa asked, "Who writes the margins?" Maribel said, "Those who profit." Amina's personal backstory is long and layered and must be told in full. As a child, she learned the taste of boiled greens and the weight of an early morning hush. Her father, Mateo, had traded his last pair of boots and a silver button to clear a tax shortfall, and the family had shrunk. She watched her mother Lena stitch until her fingers bled and learned to count thread as if counting days. In adolescence, she taught herself to read fragments left by a traveling teacher and kept a notebook hidden under a floorboard where she drew faces she liked. She loved the river at dusk and would press her palms to its cool lip and whisper names she feared to say aloud. Her schooling was a patchwork of chores and the few hours when the minister allowed a girl to recite psalms in exchange for a loaf. The ledger that named her as property never accounted for the day she rescued a neighbor boy from a broken trap or the song she hummed to soothe an infant. When Mateo fell sick and could not harvest his share, the family offered labor that became permanent assignment to the household. The backstory explains why her affair with a field hand named Daniel felt like the only thing that belonged to her, and why its discovery became a double betrayal. These details matter because they show how identity was stolen in increments by debt, by custom, and by the ordinary language of records that pretended not to own hearts. The procedures after accusation resembled rituals of reconfiguration. There were baths, said to be purifying, and shavings of hair, and the reading of vows in front of the household altar. These were described in a small folder in the county archive labeled Morality Proceedings. The folder contains a transcript where Master Henry declares the woman must be set aside for corrective service, and Pastor Jonas recites a benediction that uses legal phrasing. The scenes were sensory and intimate. Imagine steam fogging a wooden room, the smell of lye and boiled herbs, the rough cloth of a shirt damp against skin, the scraping of a comb removing braids that held memories, the metallic clink of a token being cut from a chain, and the low chant of officials who transform privacy into ordinance. The dialogue in one recorded proceeding presents 11 exchanges that read like a tribunal. Master Henry said, "We have witnesses." Amina answered, "I never meant harm." Caleb said, "She was seen with Daniel." Amina said, "We spoke in the field." Pastor Jonas said, "That is not permitted." Amina said, "He loves me." Thomas said, "The ledger notes liaison." Daniel said, "She is honest." Rosa said, "She bore water for me." Maribel said, "She cared for my child." Evelyn said, "We cannot condone disorder." Master Henry said, "Then her status must change." Amina said, "What will you call me?" Pastor Jonas said, "A name of service." This extended dialogue shows how speech was a weapon to reassign identity. Moment of tension 1 came the night Amina was separated from her things and marched to a narrow room where the walls smelled of candle wax and old cloth. She felt the grain in her palm as a last touch of home, heard the creak of the bed as another woman named Lucia shifted, tasted the copper of fear, saw the small barred window slice a square of light, and felt the coldness of an authority that measured hearts for profit. The immediacy of those dozen steps toward a new legal status was a private execution. The rituals aimed to erase lineage and rename persons publicly. The household would force a ceremony recorded in a small pamphlet kept by the minister, which described the renaming as consecration. In that ceremony, names of birth were declared obsolete, and a new designation was read aloud to the assembled staff and neighbors. This was not symbolic alone. A new name meant a new line in the ledger, with altered rights, a reassigned place in the rotation of labor, and the loss of the informal protections that family networks had provided. The documentation is clinical. A page dated July lists Amina under the entry corrective assignment, with station indicated as domestic and without visitation rights. Scribe Thomas initialed the page. In practice, the reconfiguration meant that her letters were censored, her meetings limited to supervised tasks, and any affection outside sanctioned boundaries was treated as theft. The sense of touch became regulated. The smell of soap changed because the household used different supplies for those in corrective assignment. The taste of food was downgraded. Her bed was smaller. These sensory details appear in depositions from women like Lucia and in notes by Thomas. Visitors who tried to report conditions. Moment of tension 2 occurred during a public ritual where the masters used a display of sanctimony to justify intimate violence. The crowd smelled of baked bread and sweat. Voices rose and fell, the minister intones, a brass candlestick fell and clattered, the sound echoed like judgments. Amina saw Daniel across the square, his face pale. The sun burned her forehead, and the shame felt like heat that might sear memory. This event crystallized the double violence of spectacle and law. Life inside the household after renaming became a regimen of surveillance and controlled labor. Days began with inspection led by Caleb at dawn, when the air still bit with cold and the hands were quiet. The schedule was written on a board: wash, scrub, prepare, mend, serve, harvest, spin. The punishments for small breaches were public and designed to humiliate. Mistress Evelyn would deliver lectures in the pantry that smelled of vinegar and old sugar, naming infractions and listing previous transgressions read from a slim notebook. Where once informal ties allowed whispered help from Rosa the cook or Nurse Maribel, after reassignments, those acts were policed. The staff included names and roles that mattered in daily control. Rosa stirred pots and muttered remedies. Caleb measured rations and kept the whip nearby. Pastor Jonas recorded confessions and certified punishments. Scribe Thomas filed transfers. Miguel delivered baskets and sometimes looked away. Nurse Maribel sewed shirts and passed notes under plates. Lucia shared a bunk and watched Amina sleep. In one crowded scene, there are 8 exchanges of conversation that trace the enforcement of rules. Caleb said, "Line up for inspection." Rosa said, "Hold your heads." Maribel said, "Do not speak to outsiders." Thomas said, "The ledger is closed." Miguel said, "Keep busy." Lucia said, "Sing while you work." Pastor Jonas said, "Repentance will save you." Evelyn said, "Order is everything." These exchanges illustrate how ordinary talk became part of governance. Moment of tension 3 erupted when a forbidden note was found folded into a shirt, and reading it led to a punitive ritual that was both intimate and public. A scrap of paper smelled of river mud, and the ink blurred where tears had fallen. The discovery triggered a rapid movement of hands and documents, and the sudden cold of legal language pronouncing a private act criminal and a relationship taxable. The moment lasted minutes, but it fractured lives into before and after. The ceremonies of control escalated to the point where masters used religious covers to commit acts that violated bodies under the guise of discipline. A public reconciliation was convened in which the minister read a passage while the household listened, and in which Amina was compelled to stand and recite a formula that negated consent. In some records kept by visiting inspectors, the phrase corrective intimacy appears as the term used to describe a coerced union instituted by those in power. Instances in the archive include testimony from an investigator named Lewis, who cataloged patterns where the supposed aim of restoration masked coercion. The voices of survivors are scattered in marginalia and in letters hidden under floorboards. In one such letter addressed to Rosa and written in a cramped hand, Amina wrote, "I was made to kneel and promise before a Bible that was used to hold a coin." She told how a man named Julian contracted with Master Henry to regularize the liaison, how the agreement had clauses about secrecy and about children being recorded as property of the household. The abuse was not merely corporal, it restructured motherhood into a ledger entry. Resistance took many forms: small acts of sabotage like spilling dye into cloth, slow work on purpose, secret teaching of letters to children, shared songs that encoded instructions, letters smeared and hidden under bricks. There were also attempts at legal redress, collected in sworn statements and appeals to county officials. A petition signed by Lucia, Rosa, Maribel, and a handful of field hands named Miguel and Daniel tried to expose the household practices. The petition was addressed to the magistrate and to Pastor Jonas and is preserved in an envelope stamped "Refused." Public reprisals followed. Those who helped were moved away, like Daniel, who was transferred to a distant estate, and Lucia, who was publicly punished with a fine in the record and with a beating in the hut. The ledger noted transfers as logistical notes, but in life they read like exiles. In one recorded scene of resistance, there are 7 exchanges. Daniel said, "We will speak." Rosa said, "Our voices matter." Maribel said, "We must be careful." Lucia said, "They will hear us." Caleb said, "Do not stir trouble." Evelyn said, "You forget your place." Thomas said, "Then you shall be moved." The push and the shove of authority is visible in every name. Three particular instances of brutal reprisal stand out and were recorded in different formats. One is a ledger entry where a woman named Anna was listed as penal labor and vanished from family registers for years. Another is a marginal note by a visiting teacher who found a child crying in a cellar described as withdrawn and unregistered. A third is a hidden deposit of letters bound together and buried beneath a hearth which describe beatings, forced transfers, and the shipping of children across counties. These materials are part of what makes the case undeniable. After the events, the archive shows attempts at erasure. Pages were trimmed, entries rewritten, and in one instance, a minister's journal was water damaged in a pattern that looks deliberate. Yet, traces persist. A stitched cuff with names sewn in by a woman's own hand, a ledger page with an erased entry, a coin with initials scratched out. The work of historians and archivists like Dr. Lewis, Professor Andrews at the State University, and a local historian named Amelia has been to piece together fragments and to publish transcriptions. They brought forward witness statements from Rosa, Maribel, and Lucia and correlated them with tax rolls and shipping manifests. What emerges is a pattern where institutional language converted intimacy into property, and where punishment was not sufficient because the real act was transformation of social belonging into accountancy. 1 month after the principal scandal reached the magistrate, the household had closed ranks. Some names were moved quietly and visits curtailed. 3 months later, the county published a short note of inquiry that read more like an administrative check than a moral condemnation. 6 months on, a public letter from the magistrate recommended oversight and the parish issued statements about charity and restoration, while the ledgers quietly updated the columns. Those temporal marks are visible in the archive, and they track not a clean justice, but a slow negotiation of reputation. The consequences extended beyond immediate bodies. Children who had been associated with accused women were reassigned in records to other households, and their genealogies in public documents were altered. Descendants would discover discrepancies decades later when researching family trees. The social machinery continued to churn, even as some public actors claimed reform. In conclusion, Amina did not die as a story. She died as a set of entries that tried to conceal a web of coercion. The ledgers, the letters, and the ministerial notes show a system where religion and household authority were instrumentalized to punish what was called transgression, but what in reality amounted to seizure of autonomy. The documentation is clear on the mechanics, even when language around morality obscures motive. If you believe these voices deserve attention, share this video so the documents named here are discussed, not left to sit in closets. If you were moved by Amina or by Rosa or by Lucia, tell us in the comments which revelation shocked you most. Begin your comment with "shock" and explain why. Your responses determine what we will investigate next and whether we will bring specialists to verify new fragments. If you value careful archival work and want to see more files opened, subscribe. Our work depends on connecting records to human faces and on keeping these stories from being rewritten. The monuments and the ledgers will not speak for themselves. Those who kept the books wanted order and profit, and they used sacred language to do it. The scraps in attics and the pages in county vaults show what ordinary people experienced. The final image to hold is simple: a small name stitched into a cuff by a woman who was told her name no longer mattered. That stitch is both a protest and a record that outlived a willful forgetting. If you want the next file unsealed, subscribe now and help us bring more of these hidden papers into the light.